watching Channel Africa Conversations.
I actually don't recognize it as a cultural practice. That's what I'm saying. I recognize this for the violence that it is. So part of the change, it's for us in the media, storytellers, donors, education system, the health system needs to recognize this for the violence that it is.
Hello and welcome to Channel Africa Conversations. I'm your host, Peter Ndoro. Today we're joined by one of the most courageous and influential voices in global mental health and gender rights, Dr Leyla Hussein. She's a British-Somali psychotherapist, an activist as well as an advocate. She's worked tirelessly to end gender-based violence, particularly female genital mutilation and cutting, and to champion culturally grounded mental health care for African and diaspora communities. Dr. Hussein brings a powerful voice to the conversation around identity, healing, and decolonizing care. Today we explore her life's work and the broader movement for African-led survivor-centered solutions to some of the continent's and the diaspora's most deeply rooted social challenges. Dr. Hussein is a Global Advocacy Director, the Girl Generation Support to the Africa-led movement to end FGM. Leyla, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Channel Africa Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really happy to be here and to be having this conversation with you.
So Leyla, your personal journey really has shaped your work. And I wonder what first moved you to combine therapy, activism, and advocacy?
Well, I think it's important to give a bit of a context. So my work really began from a place of pain, actually. So I'm a survivor of female genital mutilation. For your audience who doesn't know what that is, this is a violence where over 230 million girls are now living with, who this is violence that they've been subjected to as children. So I'm a survivor of that violence, unfortunately. So that's really what led me to this, journey. So I carried that trauma of silence for many, many years. It was only after I had my daughter, I was 21, nearly 22, 23 years ago now. And I met a nurse who finally asked me that question, have you been subjected to this? Have you undergone female genital mutilation? And I was very, I wasn't very shocked about the question, more like I was actually just like, why did she even ask it? And this is so normal in my community. But actually, she wasn't just a nurse, she was also a therapist. So my conversation around thaRapy really began from that first question. It was just the way she asked me the question, but she said, can I check? I mean, my response was very quickly, oh no, I haven't had the worst type. And really that's where my journey began. And early on, I noticed creating a safe space for survivors is very critical in order to deal with any social justice issues, right? So I had a daughter who was only 3 months old at the time, and I wanted to make sure that she wasn't subjected to this. So that's where my advocacy work began. But my therapeutic work was very much embedded through that conversation with a nurse called Jennifer Bourne, but who was also a qualified psychotherapist. I actually ended up working with her as I became a youth outreach worker in that space. She encouraged me to go and do some basic counseling course, but that led to nearly 4-year training of becoming a psychotherapist. Yeah, so that's really what led me to my activism and advocacy, and then embedded by really this therapeutic work. Because how do we do social justice work without also doing the healing work?
So being a survivor, did that change the way you think about mental health and trauma?
100%, because I mean, for one, as a Black person, I mean, maybe I can speak for majority of Black people. We don't even have the language for mental health or well-being, right? So my mental health was absolutely affected by being a survivor of female genital mutilation. And I'll give you the context. Just imagine a child grabbed, pinned to a table by people they trust the most, and a body part was removed with a weapon. A knife is a weapon, whatever object that's called. So you can imagine the lifelong trauma that now you have to deal with. A lot of FGM survivors, including myself, we have to deal with PTSD, recurring flashbacks, ongoing depression. And we currently, the current status of the world also is very much triggering. So mental health, but what I noticed very early on in my advocacy work, especially around the anti-FGM movement, mental health was mentioned, but it was rarely being discussed because the focus was so much on protecting girls from the physical harm, which you can understand when you see the level of physical trauma that happens. But mental health wasn't being discussed. And I guess for me, it was, and what led me to my therapeutic career through that was when you're training as a therapist, you have to be in therapy yourself. And what I noticed very early on in my therapeutic, when I was in therapy myself, I had to constantly explain what FGM was to the therapist because you could just see the shock in their face when I tell them this is something I've experienced. And it's, I mean, what we're talking about is a pandemic of violence against women and girls, especially if you look at the African context again. Every 14 minutes, a girl will be dying from this. This is a recent stats that came out from the University of Birmingham where girls are dying. So when I say I'm a survivor, I genuinely survived from something that could have killed me. So you can imagine the impact that has on you at all times, especially psychologically.
I've been a journalist many, many years now, and when we talk about decolonization, we have very specific ideas of what that means. You talk about the decolonization of mental health. Help me understand what that means practically, particularly for Africans and diaspora communities.
Well, it means our narratives, healing, our terms, and recognizing that Western mental health system were not built for us. I remember when I was training, again, I was built, the system I was taught was the Western system. I mean, I was one of the lucky ones. I was very lucky to have had one of my professors happen to be a Black Nigerian woman. So that is very rare to have that in the mental health space. So part of the decolonization is also who's also teaching you. So I was very lucky to have had a professor who encouraged me to create a space for Black and African women, those marginalized groups, but majority we just don't. So decolonizing mental health is just about centering community wisdom, spirituality, storytelling, collective care, things our communities have always practiced. Africans have always practiced this. It's also about resisting the idea that trauma must always be, it must be a disorder. Like, I mean, we have disorders, but it must be this. Because Africans have always had their own systems in place. And I'll give you another example. When I founded the Dahlia Project, which is the first counseling service for FGM survivors in the UK, I used to run group sessions, and these are mainly African women. And when we assess the group sessions, we will ask the women, what would you like to incorporate into these group sessions? And the first thing they would say, oh, actually, when I'll give an example of Eritrean women that we worked with. They wanted popcorn and tea and coffee because it's that ceremony, being in the group together, drinking tea, drinking coffee. So that's really the context I'm referring to. And usually by decolonizing, by even, I know from my experience, I know people try to take my license away at one point. They're like, this is not what you were taught, Leyla. This is so unethical. You can't be bringing people coffees and teas and popcorn. But I guess the therapeutic teachings I've had absolutely did not fit to the kind of therapy my mom needed. Even I still need. Actually, what I really struggled with when I was in therapy at the time, I could never find a Black therapist, African, who really understood my experience. Yeah. So that's what I mean by decolonizing the system, because we still live in a world where we are still conforming to Western approaches than actually looking at what does our African healing, collective healing, Black healing, what does that actually look like?
Wow. Okay. So what we know for sure is that gender-based violence, particularly FGM, remains a taboo topic in many spaces. And I wonder Why is mental health support for survivors such a critical piece of the puzzle?
Yeah, I mean, if I maybe speak to, I mean, all survivors of violence absolutely need that space to, because for me, healing and justice, really, it has to be together. You can't ask one without the other. We can't ask survivors of violence to go and get justice without having an aspect of healing. But having the aspect of healing is acknowledging the trauma. And if I maybe use the example of FGM survivors, so historically, FGM survivors weren't even recognized as women who've experienced severe violence, right? It was something that was considered traditional cultural practice. You know, FGM, it's something that happens in such communities. We need to talk to elders and community leaders in order to eradicate it. You can already see the language and how harmful that actually is. But when we're talking about female genital mutilation, I remember actually my professor at the time when I was training really challenged me on this narrative. She said, Leyla, if you are going to be working with women who've experienced FGM as children, you are dealing with a patient who has who's presenting with early childhood trauma, sexual violence, early childhood violence, you know, sexual assault. So that's how we need to reframe it back. And the reason I don't know why it's still a taboo issue. I think there's something around, there's shame around this, especially amongst the Black community. There's a sense of, oh God, here's one more thing that's barbaric that Black people are dealing with. Well, I would love to tell Black people, we're not the only ones who deal with this, by the way. If I just take us off a little bit of just FGM, but you know, in the West, in the Western society, in the Northern Hemisphere of the world, you know, labiaplasty is a big surgery that women now, I think in the UK, it's the second cosmetic surgery. They call it cosmetic surgery, but we know we need to have this done in order to be accepted. So support for survivors of violence is not just let's create a safe space, but it's really looking at the history of being coerced into violence, made the idea of telling FGM survivors, no, your pain is different, you know, your own is a cultural practice. That itself is so harmful. But you see why this issue has remained under the rugs, still not out there. And I really, I'm still struggling, especially if I come back to Africa, the fact that we are not outraged, that we're not out there really upset about this, because if we're saying every 12 minutes a girl is going to die, I mean, I think the stats from University of Birmingham urge everybody to really look at this. They looked at how many girls die from FGM, compared it to how many children are dying from malaria, and it's literally not, the numbers are not that much of a difference. That is the pandemic we're dealing with. So that's why the stories of survivors are absolutely critical. So supporting survivors is what's going to get us the results that we now need, because we haven't been creating a safe space for survivors. Actually, we've been shutting them down and we've been watering down their experiences for a very long time.
You talk about it being a cultural practice, and sadly it is. I mean, I think recently I did an interview where I think it was the Gambia, where the parliamentarians were actually considering reversing a ban on FGM.
Yeah.
And then you hear stories of young girls who, if they don't get cut, feel like they're being left behind or don't fit. It's that
Yeah.
deeply entrenched. How do we change such a deep-rooted, long-practiced cultural practice such as this?
Well, I want to clarify, I actually don't recognize it as a cultural practice. That's what I'm saying. I recognize this for the violence that it is. So part of the change, it's for us in the media, storytellers, donors, education system, the health system needs to recognize this for the violence that it is. The reason girls have been feeling, and the societies who are impacted by this have been feeling like this, is because we made them feel they can't belong. But the moment we change the language, for example, my current work with the girl generation, this is a program which is supporting the current African movement to end female genital mutilation. We work in 4 African countries. So we published a position paper on the power of language, literally how harmful language has been. So FGM has been isolated for a very long time because of the language we've been using. So it's not a practice. Even have you noticed, I think you and I said practice 3 times, because you don't practice violence. We don't practice, but also that language is always used when it's only Black and brown children. You never hear that language being used. So I want to urge, especially as Black and brown people, to really reframe our language. Touching a child's genitalia, grabbing a child, pinning them to a table, we have violated them. Forget about the cutting and the mutilation, that comes afterwards, but there's so much violence that's happened. And what kind of message does that send? And what we're saying to our girls, that you need to be violated in such a way for you to be accepted, because that's the message we are constantly passing on. We are constantly passing that on. So that has to change. So it's reframing the language is where we need to go back and re-begin. And it starts with all of us, all of us.
No, I hear you, and I certainly will help in the media to try and change the language and reframe people's mindsets on it. And it is something that we often don't think about because it's just been handed down for us and we've never really thought about it. Let's talk then about the girl generation, support to the Africa-led movement to end FGM, this Survivors Leadership Initiative. How does this program support survivors of FGM and with mental health and emotional well-being?
So, I mean, historically, we know with any movement, it was led by those impacted by it, right? Whether it's the civil rights movement, which is now the new Black Lives Matter movement, if we look at the Me Too movement. So if we really, at the girl generation, we recognize survivors really play a key role. I mean, and we're not saying this is only on survivors, by the way. So we need to really demystify that. It's not the agenda is not just survivors are going to fix this. No, survivors play a critical role because we need their stories to really make changes to policies. So the survivor-led initiative is built on the belief that survivors are not victims. For one, they're actually experts. The amount of times, and by the way, I'm a survivor myself, the amount of times I've been invited to a room, with other mental health experts or other health experts, but I was never introduced as a psychotherapist or mental health expert. I was always introduced as a survivor or a victim of FGM. So really for us, that was very important to really ensure survivors who are in such movements are also experts. So we offer training that blends therapeutic tools with leadership development, which is embedded in African feminism, helping survivors hold space for others and while prioritizing their own healing, because survivors are quite critical to this, but they are reliving their trauma over and over again. So how they take care of themselves is a big part of this work. Through workshop, peer support, and creative expressions, survivors learn to lean on each other. They create their own support groups. I mean, now they've set up Kenya. So we work in Kenya, Ethiopia, Somaliland, and Senegal. So Kenya has now set up its first all the 4 countries have set up their first survivors network. So they set up their first survivors network. So you can see just by giving these tools, the Kani community will build. And really, I mean, now the women, they run it themselves. We are there just to support. And I know they want to make this more global. So that's really what we are doing. And obviously, a lot of this work, it's ongoing work. We are in contact with the women. It's not a tick box exercise. So the work of survival, and it's something really, when we developed this tool, we were thinking about other global movements. So this is something other movements can take on and really just, use the same template and use it on their movements. The whole idea is to safeguard the survivor while recognizing them as the experts.
So what's the response been like from the communities? And it must be a difficult thing to measure, the kind of impact you're having on such deeply personal, emotional work like this.
Yeah. I mean, in my early career, by the way, just to again clarify that the anti-FGM movement I mean, I was raised in the UK, but the UK movement started in the 60s. Africa, I mean, it goes back to the 1940s. I mean, from Kenya to Somalia. I will tell you, the women who started this movement really had a hard time, really. But I think now where we're at, especially with the work with the survivors, has been extremely powerful. We've seen women gone from being silent to now being storytellers, from feeling shame to feeling extreme pride now. They're building networks and launching their own initiatives. I mean, not just in this kind of movement, right? I mean, launching their own businesses, becoming advocates themselves. So measuring this work goes beyond the numbers, I feel. You can't I think just ticking numbers or finding numbers is not, that's not where we stop. I think it's the way survivors show up, right? Seeing the changes and how, and through our communication work, our storytelling work, I would actually urge you to go to our page at the Girl Generation to really see some of those stories, just to really, we document stories, like track their personal growth, gather community feedback. I mean, healing is not always easy, and you can't really measure it, but you can see the visibility, right? You see, sometimes there are women we haven't seen for a year, then we see them a year later, and you can just see the transformation. And that's really how we are seeing the response and beginning to see some of that, measure that's coming up. Actually, one of my favorite stories, usually it's when a woman says, hey, I don't even want to be part of this movement. I'm going to go and live my life. For me, that's a great outcome, because, working in these movements, it's quite difficult. So I love when someone chooses their life over this. Yeah.
So, sadly, Africa, patriarchal society, generally north to south. Have you been seeing a lot of pushback from men? Because I suspect that for this to work, you have to have a lot of men champions joining the movement.
I mean, historically, this movement, by the way, I hate when people say, where are the men? Men have always been allies. Men have always been part of this movement. I mean, the Girl Generation, we work with amazing men, but I think there's a difference between men who take up space and men who create space, right? They create because they know their privilege, especially in the African context. It's men are there to create that space and to allow women to come into that space. So men are absolutely big part of it. I mean, I always say, hey, in order even for us to be funded by the UK government, we needed some men to sign off on it. So it's like men have always been part of. So it's critical that everyone, but it's recognizing the position men play is quite critical. Like, you're an example. I mean, you're a male and journalist, and you're using a segment, just looking at this, that's you using your position as a man, because men do come with different privileges that sadly women don't come with.
How do we make the jump from legislation to actually becoming a way of life? Because I think enough governments have banned it. Enough legislation has been written to say you can't do this anymore, but somehow enforcing it seems to be a really difficult thing to do.
I'm someone 23, nearly 23 years ago, when I saw the FGM Act in the UK, I thought this is great, it's amazing. But the more I dig deep into this, I realized actually the laws haven't helped at all. And I tell you why. It's because we othered the issue. And that's been the problem. That's been the problem. Why are we othering this specific issue? And it's because, again, when it's a Black and brown child, it's a whole different ballgame. It's like we need to come up with a different law. If white children would be mutilated, there wouldn't be a separate law. They'll be convicted under the child abuse. So for me, I think we need to get there. For example, France, out of all the countries, tonight, to use France as a great example. I mean, France actually, I think they got it right. They don't have an FGM Act. They have one of the highest convictions in the world, because for them, they convict under the Child Abuse Act, grievous bodily harm. I mean, there's a whole list. They felt then, because they said, if you cut a child's finger or toe or arm, same law, we are not creating. So, and these laws, the FGM Acts, have a lot of loopholes that are causing a lot more problems. Actually, I was talking to my team yesterday and I said, we really need to really review these acts quite deeply to see, are they actually working? And we need to be honest if they're not working. But we do have laws that already tell us, every country in the world has a law that says to us, you cannot physically harm a child. I think that's what needs to happen. And again, it goes back to reframing, not just the language, but this is also reframing it back to reframing the language means we can now deal with it accordingly by calling it sexual violence, child abuse, grievous bodily harm. Using that language means we can actually deal with it accordingly via the law. Because I felt, what was happening in Gambia was crazy, and Africa's having a beautiful awakening at the moment, right? Where we are claiming back African values, African principles, but we're somehow skipping when it comes to women and girls. It's like, no, we're going to claim things that are really harming, violence that harm women in order just to show some sort of resistance to the West. So it's like the women have been sacrificed, women and girls have been sacrificed again. So it's like we're on this good route, but can we at least please keep this away from us? I mean, when I now go on any stage, and I say this right now, I am declaring that FGM, it's not my culture. I'm African, I'm Somali, I'm British. FGM is not my culture. And I would like to say FGM is not your culture. Just because you're Black and African, that should not be imposed on you. It's like saying to white people, it's colonization and slavery. Was that your culture? We would never dare say that. Why do we always have to claim violence as part of our culture? So again, the change really needs to begin with us, especially here in this continent. We have to start saying, hey, this is not our culture. This is violence. Our children are not going to be harmed like this.
Are you finding that this is a generational thing that's starting to shift as younger and younger people become mothers like you? Your grandmother had a different world that she lived in at the time. And you now, having traveled, lived abroad, is it changing as the generations change, or what have you observed?
Yeah, I mean, by the way, I grew up abroad, but I grew up in a very conservative communities. Britain is very, very conservative. I just want to put that out there. Actually, a lot of my liberal views and freedom really was born out of Africa, especially in Kenya. So I worked a lot in Kenya. I now work in Kenya and live in Kenya. So there's a younger generation with social media who are sharing information now. I think if anything good came out of tech, it's that. What technology gave us is a community you can now reach to and share similar views. So I think the next generation, absolutely, I feel very hopeful. Oh my God, especially seeing the current uprise with young people everywhere, from the US to Europe to Africa. Gen Z are definitely going to be remembered for their resistance and standing against injustices. So I think I'm absolutely serious. I am having goosebumps just thinking about it. I mean, I do remind them, my daughter's a Gen Z, I do remind them that we had to do the hard work for them to do this. Take credit to. We feel extremely hopeful because I'm watching social media, I'm watching the information young people are sharing. I mean, when I talk to my daughter, my younger cousins or nieces, they are literally flabbergasted when I have to say, was considered our culture. And they're like, why is this? I mean, they would never accept it. So that gives me 100% so much hope. And by the way, as a mother, I mean, I always say my daughter was my muse. It wasn't just, I realized when I had her, I wasn't just protecting her from female genital mutilation. I had the rude awakening, realizing that my daughter still existed in a world that really hates women and girls. Not discriminates, hates women and girls. Like, I really want to be blunt about this. And for me, it was, how do we now collectively ensure that girls are protected? I mean, coming back to the world of the girl generation, we are very clear that we are girl-centered. The girl comes first. We have to put her at the center of everything, but we have to work with her whole world in order to make sure she's okay, including the health system she has access to, the justice system, her family, the men in her life, so that's all. But we need to be very blunt that girls are not safe. I mean, the African girl child, it's still the most vulnerable human being in the world that gets left behind. So that's who I'm speaking to when I'm talking about this work.
Dr. Leyla Hussein, it's really has been an honor and a pleasure to talk to you on Channel Africa Conversations. Thank you so much indeed for joining us, and your story inspiring, and the work that you're doing. Thank you so much indeed for it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
And that's how we come to the end of today's edition of Channel Africa Conversations. Thanks so much indeed for tuning in. Before I go, a quick reminder that we'd love to get your feedback on our programs. Let us know. You can see on your screens now the social media pages where you can engage. Let us know the kind of conversations you'd like to see more of, and maybe the kind of people that you'd like us to be in conversation with. We look forward to hearing from you. From me and the team, until the next time, goodbye.